Good morning. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other today on country. I'm coming to you from the State Library of New South Wales, a comparatively young cultural institution that sits on one of the world's great ancient libraries, a rich repository of oral tradition. I am on Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are here with us this morning. My name's Rachel Franks. I'm the coordinator of scholarship here at the State Library, and today for our Scholar Talk, it's all about a Scot who came to colonial Australia and became one of Sydney's most important and certainly one of the most interesting citizens. It's a privilege this morning to introduce Emeritus Professor Penny Russell. She was our 2023 Ross Steele AM Fellow here at the library, and today she's going to be talking about some of her work on John Rae. Penny will be well known to many of you here today. She is, of course, the author of this fabulous book. If you haven't read it, get cracking to your local bookstore or library. It has been out for a few years now, but it is as fresh as if it was published just yesterday. So that's Savage All Civilized, a history of manners in colonial Sydney, and something perhaps we could learn from today, especially on public transport. Now, some of you might also be familiar with Sydney's first full-time permanent town clerk, John Rae, who, in between his duties for the city of Sydney, made an extraordinary number of contributions to our cultural life. Now, as always, if you have any questions for Penny about John Rae this morning, please use the chat feature in Zoom, and I'll be back soon to ask them for you. But for now, please welcome Penny to tell us a little bit more about John. Thanks, Penny.
Thanks very much, Rachel. I'm just about to share my screen and start the presentation. So is that all working properly?
It looks fabulous. Thanks, Penny.
Terrific. Thanks, Rachel. And thank you very much for that kind introduction. Knowing your love and deep knowledge yourself of John Rae, I can only hope that this talk can do some small justice to the richness of the library's collections on Rae and the generosity of the library's fellowships, for both of which I'm extremely grateful. As I begin my talk, I too wish to acknowledge that it was researched and written on, and indeed chiefly concerns, the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects too to the traditional owners of the beautiful region on which Sydney is built, their elders and leaders past and present. It's the more important to make this acknowledgement with care, I think, because it is one that John Rae, in his enthusiasm for Sydney's progress, would never have made himself. As we can never forget the brutal impact of dispossession, environmental destruction and disease that Sydney's growth wrought upon Sydney's First Nations people. The triumphalist colonialism of early settlers, which include Rae, can make for uncomfortable reading when the implicit racial assumptions on which it was always based are explicitly revealed. I feel there's nothing to be gained by dwelling on or repeating the kinds of racist cliches that Rae often fell into in both his public and his writing and his private writing. And as far as possible, I've avoided doing so in this paper. But they are an integral part of Rae's vision of Sydney, and that's a point that I will return to towards the end of the paper. My entry point for today's paper is a suite of watercoloured sketches that were made by John Rae, signed by him and dated 1842, but not actually published and released, released to the public until much later in the 1890s, when they were published in the form of a collection of photographs of the watercolours. I love these sketches, both for their aesthetic appeal and for the promise they bring of historical truthfulness. I love their delicacy and the muted tints that suggest, rather than trying to emulate, the colour of the scenes that they depict. I love the ordinariness of them, the commitment to representing a length of George Street or of York Street over any principles of the picturesque. I love their careful design, the precision of line, even of the more distant buildings, the carefully legible lettering on the sides of some of the shops. I love the casually populated streets, the suggestion of people going about their business on an ordinary day, frozen into momentary immobility and captured for posterity. The sketches have something to me of the appeal of a design for a film set. They offer the same reassuring sense that you could, out of this, construct a plausible sort of line of buildings to form a street scene. And at times I've lent heavily into that promise. Rae is, in a sense, my set designer for the world of 1840 Sydney that I'm trying to build in my book about the Thompsons, a branch of my own family whose draper's shop would surely have appeared in one of Rae's sketches if only he had been considerate enough to pop around the corner into Pitt Street and take that view as well. When I ran a first-year seminar a few years ago on 1840 Sydney, Rae's sketches provided my headline image, an introductory lesson, and a recurrent motif. But the air of authenticity in these pictures masks certain ambiguities, perhaps none of them materially significant, but still lurking there, about the origins and the dating of the sketches. As the State Library's catalogue will tell you, though the signature and date appear to be genuinely in Rae's writing, you can see them down there in the bottom of the right corner of the picture. They do appear to have been added only after the volume of photographs of the sketches without signature was published in 1893. And at least one picture that is so dated, 1842, includes a building, indeed the State Library of New South Wales, that was not in fact completed until 1845. Why would Rae choose 1842 as the date of the images if some of them actually date from other years? By emphasising this date, he claimed, at least implicitly, that the sketches were made in connection with a project that had consumed much of his time and attention during 1842, the production of a series of lithographed views of Sydney from pictures made by the artist John Skinner Prout, with an accompanying text or letterpress that was written by Rae himself. This version that you're seeing here on the screen now has been later coloured. The lithographs, when they appeared in 1842, were in black and white, but it gives a sort of a nice representation of what it was that they were trying to do with these views, providing both an illustration and a more detailed written text that told the viewers exactly what it is that they were looking at. The project was self-consciously designed to mark Sydney's present state of progress in 1842 and to provide first-hand information and images of the town for the better information of intending emigrants. Prout and Rae conceived of it as an annual on a model of landscape annuals that was popular in England at the time. But difficulties in printing and obtaining suitable paper hampered the project, and the fourth issue was its last. The final instalment, however, which came out in early 1844, did murmur of the possibility of subsequent issues. And the most obvious assumption is that Rae made his sketches of Sydney alongside Prout, making scenes that were intended for the purpose of later issues. The final image in Sydney Illustrated makes this assumption all the more convincing, because it bears a close resemblance to one of Rae's sketches. And you can see on the left there, the picture that Rae created for Sydney Illustrated in 1842, and the watercolour of George Street looking north. Both of them have the same title that Rae produced and circulated in the 1890s. And the very obvious similarities in those images, I think, sort of definitely make it appear that these sketches were a product of that moment. John Rae was known for using a camera to make panoramic views of Sydney during the late 1840s and the 1850s, and his panoramic views of Illawarra, of Newcastle, and of Hyde Park, for example, are well known. Martin Jolly, to whom I'm very indebted on this point, has pointed out that some of Rae's these sketches of Sydney 1842 also bear signs of having been made with the assistance of a camera obscura, or a sketching camera, which means basically a camera that created a view from which the observer could sort of sketch the outline that the camera sort of threw onto a page. So it's not a photographic reproduction, but the turning, as Rae himself explained it once, of a vertical view of a panorama into something that could be easily sketched with a pencil, following the outlines of the image. Rae himself, interviewed by a journalist following the publication of the photographs of the views in 1894, talked of using a camera to make the pictures, pointing in particular to this image of York Street, and two blurry dots in the background of this image, which depict, he said, two men in the stocks outside the police court, a form of punishment, a particular form of corporal and humiliating punishment, which he said he had never previously observed in Sydney. "It's the only time I ever saw such a punishment," said Mr. Rae, "and then you see I only saw it in the camera, which simply pictured the whole surroundings faithfully. I didn't know myself what it meant till I inquired, but there they are." And it's very difficult to actually identify that any of these dots in the distant background are in fact figures of men in the stocks, but the combination of Rae's memory and of the event and those various blurry dots sort of give you a sense of this, a moment of objective truth, in a way, of an image of something that Rae himself had not perceived, but that was captured with the power of a camera. Now, it is known that Rae made himself a camera obscura. He completed it in the second half of 1847, and he publicly extolled the use of this cheap and simple device as a wholesome entertainment for boys. But it was less clear that he had the use of a camera in 1842, and one of the challenges that Martin set me in conversation was to find out whether I could sort of learn anything more about whether, in fact, it did have a camera at this time. I began to wish for certainty, especially as that image of York Street seems to represent the latest recorded use of the stocks as punishment in Sydney, which makes the dating of this image rather more significant. Did Rae make his sketches of Sydney in 1842, as his dating of them claimed, or did he make them later, in or after 1847, with the use of his camera? Could he claim for them both the cultural authority of association with the public of Sydney Illustrated, as the date implicitly did, and the objective authority of the camera's impartial gaze? I hoped I would find the answer to this question within the pages of John Rae's letter book, in which he preserved copies of almost the entirety of his personal correspondence between 1840 and 1854, a span that generously covers the period of possibility. Surely in a letter book that comprises some 900 closely written pages and well over 100,000 words, most of them devoted to Rae's reports on his doings to family and friends, I would find some reference to the time when he went about Sydney, making faithful, careful sketches of street scenes. I blithely embarked on the project of reading and transcribing the letters, thinking this might constitute only a preliminary phase of my research. Instead, it has consumed almost the whole of my attention, even though the specific answers I was looking for long proved frustratingly elusive. Rae does have a lot to say about his collaboration with Prout on Sydney Illustrated in 1842. He also has a lot to say about the design and creation of his camera in 1847. He also describes in detail various views that he took from nature around Sydney during the 1840s, some of which he was quite proud of, but nowhere does he talk directly about creating a suite of streetscapes of his own. I did in the end find a few tantalising clues, which I will return to, but by the time I did, it was clear that the riches of the letter book lay less in specific details of the how or when of Rae's project, and more in the light that it shed on the why, the impulses, the talents, the ambitions, friendships, obligations, ideologies, and emotions that together fueled his urge to record and interpret, by any means to hand, his experience of this colonial town. So I want to spend some time now on the John Rae of the letter books, before returning at the end to some speculative thoughts about the provenance and purpose of the images. But first, what is this letter book of which I speak? Rae who was, as we shall see, an enthusiastic embracer of new technologies, had a copying machine at his place of business on which he could throw off copies of all of his business correspondence and reports. Early in his life in the colony, he developed the habit of writing his personal letters also while at the office so that he could take an impression of each letter before sending it off. The value of this for him was that he had a record of the letters that he had sent and the questions or requests they might contain, and could check back when replies came often months later to remind himself what those letters were responding to. It was also a way of knowing if letters had gone astray and keeping track of his own diligence or not as a correspondent. Kept him abreast of a conversation that was often extended over many months of delay. And we have to be grateful to Rae for the care he thus took. A wealth of personal letters left the colony during the 19th century, carrying accounts of colonial experience across the world. Their survival in the hands of their recipients was always a matter of chance, and the letters that do survive represent only a tiny percentage of those that were written. Intentionally or not, Rae did a great service to historians when he chose to create and preserve this record of his own writings. And I just to give a sense of the contents of the many, many pages of the letters, here is one endearing sample. His letters were written primarily to keep his family and friends up to date on his doings, his achievements, and his family life in Sydney. They are consequently richly informative on all of these areas. But in the paradox of using letters as a historical source, in the end, Rae's letters were not written to inform me or to answer any particular questions that I might choose to ask. He didn't write about taking those particular views of Sydney, and indeed his letters are so crowded with descriptions of other projects that it began to feel impossible that he could ever have found time to make them. At the times when I most hoped that I would find some reference, he seemed to be particularly busy on other projects that seemed not only distracting, but downright contradictory. To get the most out of a source like this letter book, you have to learn to ask different questions. You also have to recognize the inherent challenges and misdirects of such a source, and to remember, above all, that despite their apparent amplitude, the letters form an uneven and a necessarily incomplete record. Rae did not write every day. He only wrote when a ship was about to leave the harbour for England. And as time went on, he wrote less and less. The letters become much less regular and, over time, often quite a bit shorter. It's the usual paradox of personal writing. The more Rae was actually doing in the colony and the more interesting and absorbing he found it, the less time he had to write about it. The absence of evidence here is not always evidence of absence, but instead opens up a stream of more layered and tangentially and ultimately still pertinent questions. Who was this artist? What was his vision? Who was John Rae? This is most simply and most commonly answered by telling the story of his life as a civil servant. Born in January 1813 in Aberdeen in Scotland, Rae was educated at Aberdeen Grammar School and then at Marischal College at the University of Aberdeen, where he gained honours in many subjects and graduated with a Master of Arts at the age of 19. Accounts vary, but it appears he then went to Edinburgh to complete his studies in law before returning to Aberdeen to be articled to a solicitor's office. In 1839, he agreed to come to Sydney, giving up hope that law would prove a suitable profession for him. He agreed to come to Sydney as secretary and accountant to the North British Australasian Loan and Investment Company, which, despite its grand name, was, as far as I can tell, a very small company, newly formed in Aberdeen, among a close circle of friends and relatives, on purpose to make money for folks at home through profitable investments in what they believed to be a booming colonial economy. Rae came here with James Blakey to carry out the colonial arm of that investment. They began investing with high hopes, but they lacked the experience to make good investments or to withstand the effects of the worst depression that the colony had yet experienced, which began to bite within 2 years of their arrival. By 1842, the company was struggling and Rae's prospects seemed dim. But the formation of the Sydney Municipal Council in that year heralded a significant change in his fortunes. In July 1843, Rae became Sydney's first permanent town clerk. And though his initially generous salary was swiftly trimmed in response to the crisis, the position gave him public recognition and a measure of financial security that was rare and precious in those troubled times. After the corporation was disbanded in 1853, Rae was made one of 3 city commissioners. And in 1857, after the Legislative Assembly decided in turn to dismiss the commissioners and return to a corporation, Rae was made secretary to the Railway Commissioners, to which was soon added the duties of accountant in 1859. In 1861, he was appointed Under-Secretary for Public Works, and the role of Commissioner for Railways was subsequently added, though his salary was not increased accordingly. Those roles were separated again in 1878, with Rae remaining on as the Under-Secretary of Public Works, retiring in 1889 when he was almost 77 years old. And even then, he continued to hold a salaried position on the Civil Service Board until his final retirement in 1893. He was proud to declare that he owed these posts to merit and not to influence, and the boast in many ways seems justified. He was hardworking, intelligent, and in Rachel Franks's words, highly regarded as a very competent and level-headed bureaucrat, and so was an important and rare figure in the early halls of Australian politics and power. For much of his life, he found his salary barely sufficient to meet the demands of his family and soaring Sydney prices. And at one point, he entered into a long battle for recompense for the underpayment of his position when holding those 2 roles. But when on the apparent brink of success, his claims were rejected by a new Parks Ministry on the grounds that he was too wealthy to need the money. At his death in 1900, probate indeed was sworn at over £60,000, and the fact was widely reported in the press of the day under such headlines as "Two Rich Men's Wills, the late John Rae." The letter book, though, allows us to see an additional side of Rae's character. His letters certainly carried a strong thread of grumbling about his salary and of pride as he obtained new positions, but they also served the more important task of preserving family ties in the face of what he had to gradually recognise as a permanent separation. When he came to the colony, he had hopes that he would make his fortune and return home within perhaps 5 years. As time went on, it became increasingly clear that he would not be able to do so. Especially in the early letters, we see him straining to keep alive the relationship he had with different family members, exhorting and instructing his younger brothers, gently mocking his older brother, and expressing a pretty lively sibling rivalry with those closest to him in age, offering chivalric protection and mostly unwanted advice to his sisters, writing tenderly and with sentiment to his mother, and at times outright angrily to his father, as he reproached them with not writing to him often enough. One sister, with her husband and daughter, had travelled with him to Sydney. He described in loving detail their Aberdonian establishment, the cosy Aberdonian establishment that they had created, their domestic routines and comforts, the joy he still took in home life, and the watchful eye that he was keeping on his brother-in-law's intemperate habits. In 1845, he met and married Elizabeth Thompson, teacher at an elite ladies' school she ran with her older sisters. And with this event, Rae's epistolary efforts had not only to preserve ties, but to connect to each other new family members who might never meet in real life. He wrote with tumultuous delight after Bessie accepted his proposal, and thereafter dwelled lovingly in many letters on her virtues and graces. He proudly announced the birth and astonishing accomplishments of each of his children. He also began an occasional correspondence with Bessie's brother William, who still at that time lived in England, addressing him with all the familiarity of a brother and writing letters replete with details of his in-laws' doings. Both in content and in purpose, then, Rae's correspondence is overwhelmingly about family life, and his repetitive theme is the delight he takes in domestic life and home-centred hobbies, and his dislike of going too much into society. That said, he was drawn into society, especially in his early years in the colony, by the nature of his work and by his desire to develop and exercise his talents before an appreciative audience. However often he insisted that he did not wish to bring his name before the public, his enthusiasm for various projects and his quiet enjoyment of honours and glory pushed him often into the public domain. Before he left Scotland, he had won an elocution prize at Marischal College, had his poetry published in Aberdeen journals, and won an essay prize in Edinburgh. Before that prize was announced, He was involved in a tragic boating accident where 3 of his close friends drowned. He wrote years later in a letter to his children that as he struggled in the water, it flashed across my mind that I was doomed to perish, without knowing whether I had been successful in the matter of the prize essay. The story was by this time a polished anecdote. It was echoed again in a press interview in 1894, but it nonetheless seems to be wonderfully evocative, both of the humorous self-deprecation and of the quiet thirst for glory that was so characteristic of John Rae. Coming to Sydney removed him from an environment rich in potential mentors and worthy competitors to one where his talents had less opportunity for cultivation, but also had high scarcity value. Rae appeared to thrive in this small pond. The foundation of the Sydney School of Arts gave him scope and contacts, and he was an early member of that institution. Some pieces of writing he submitted anonymously for the critical review of Professor Rennie was singled out for praise and subsequently published in the Herald. When word got out that Rae was the author, he was invited to present at the School of Arts a series of lectures on taste, and soon after another series on the English language. He began to write with some regularity for the Herald, which published his anonymous reviews of both literature and local lectures. Despite thus scrupulously keeping his name out of the public eye, at least as a writer, word soon got out and Rae began to enjoy a measure of celebrity, as he wrote home to his brother at one point. When a debating club was mooted, he was from the first an enthusiastic participant and later became vice president. There was some talk of bringing out a magazine on literary and artistic subjects, and he was spoken of as the editor, he wrote home, but little seemed to come of that project. In 1847, inspired by his friend Prout, he was one of the principal movers behind the formation of a society for the promotion of the fine arts in Sydney. When that was established in May 1847, he was on the committee. After they opened their first exhibition of paintings in June of the same year, Rae reviewed the display anonymously, including commentary on 4 of his own watercolours in his review. An inveterate rhymester in private life, Rae also published anonymously a long narrative poem about the fancy ball held by the Mayor, James Wiltshire, in the previous year, in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1845. Later, he published a lament for the accidental death of the governor's wife, Lady Mary Fitzroy, in a carriage accident in December 1847, and in 1853 published a blank verse rendering of the Old Testament book of Isaiah, complete with explanatory notes, typesetting and binding the volume himself. And then there was art and there was photography, and include an enthusiastic dabbler in every new skill and technology. Rae experimented with composition, style and technique in line drawing, and then in watercolors, and then painting in oils, in the use and the making of a camera obscura, in the techniques of daguerreotype and type photography when those technologies became available to him. He was interested in the craft of printing too, in all of its aspects, from lithography to typesetting to bookbinding to design. Such a list of projects and accomplishments points to an extraordinary capacity for focus, for diligence, and for self-education, especially when we bear in mind that Rae only occasionally had access to expert instruction from individuals, and that he had to find most of the information he needed from books. But the variety of projects also points to a characteristic that Rae himself was acutely aware of, an enthusiastic but roving mind, swift to seize on each new enthusiasm. Whether he was sketching, writing, lecturing or printing, making a camera or drawing up house designs, or establishing a garden, he wrote of each new interest as his latest fit, his last atrocity, his present weakness, his brick and mortar mania, or his botanical insanity. He was the creature of impulse, he wrote once, and frequently caught himself up when describing the magnificent outcomes that might arise from a new undertaking, reminding his relatives, who seemed to need no reminding, that his resolutions were not always to be depended on. I was reading a lot about adult ADHD when I was reading Rae's letters for the first time, and the parallels seemed to me to be striking and irresistible, much as I dislike trying to make diagnosis in a retrospective way. But this combination of impulse and hyperfocus, his preference for late nights over early mornings, the constant self-deprecating references to his bad habits and unreliability were very resonant. Notable too are his efforts to overcome the waywardness of his attention. He wrote to his father once that though his apprenticeship in the law in Scotland would be of no direct service to him now, it had formed his character, giving him habits of regularity, though he added in brackets, "You will smile at this." To his brother George, he wrote of the novel exercise he had set himself to overcome his inability to concentrate for months after his arrival in Sydney, describing a certain restlessness that prevented me from sitting long at one subject or understanding very well what I was doing from a wandering of mind. People had told him this was the colonial condition, that no one could read anything more than novels in so warm a climate, but Rae was determined to recover his love of reading and set himself the task of concocting a multiplication table that went up to 100 by 100. And indeed, he kept it in his letter book, so there's proof that he actually did it. He went on, and I don't have time to linger over this, to explain all the various mathematical exercises that he continued to do. His chief object being, as he said, with all this cart horse work, to accustom my mind to continuous exertion. It seems to have answered the purpose well. With an admirable level of self-awareness, however, Rae seemed content to remain an enthusiastic and multifocused dilettante as long as he continued to pursue artistic and mental attainments in one form or another. He wrote to a friend in 1841 that he was quite a chapter of inconsistencies, versatile enough to fly from subject to subject, but not steady enough to stick to my music and do one thing well before I commence another. But he said this was a constant source of amusement. His mind was not allowed to run to weeds, nor was it worn out by overcropping. So on that uplifting note, let us turn from John Rae the man to consider more specifically his training and aspirations as an artist. What, if anything, do the letterbooks have to say about this? As it turns out, quite a lot. It's evident for a start that Rae already had considerable talent for sketching when he arrived in Sydney. In his letters in 1840 and 1841, he mentions from time to time his attempts to capture the Sydney scene on paper and promises, or cautiously refrains from promising, to send some of those pictures if he can complete them to his own satisfaction. Before he sent any completed drawings, he sent a rough impression of one within the body of his letter. He was apologetic about this sketch. Those spiral-looking objects like carrots standing on their base, he said, must be understood to be vessels riding at anchor, and hoped to be able to send something better soon. I have some sketches in progress, he said, from one of which the above is taken. And if I can manage to stick so long at one thing as to finish a few, I shall send you some of them one of these days. The sketches duly followed, but not for some months, and then he described them as mere daubs taken on the spot and intended to be transferred in proper shape to larger paper. The accompanying letter drew attention in particular to one that represented the scene from his office window. The intention seems to have been to invite his family to see his world through his eyes, though perhaps the choice of a harbour view had a further unintentional significance. When he wrote reproaching his family for not writing, he often talked about how his office overlooked the harbour, and this scene depicted part of his office, the view from his office window. And he wrote of the disappointment of seeing the letters come in, the ships come in, watching them arrive, only to be disappointed yet again by the failure to deliver any letters to him. Rae's letters and his sketches seemed then to strive to overcome the tyranny of distance and to give his relatives a better understanding of the state of Sydney's society or the pace of Sydney's growth. It was a way of bringing them closer. But these appeals to family feeling sat neatly alongside some more grandstanding ambitions. His own experience had taught him how difficult it was to find reliable information on the colonies. And even before he left home, he once wrote to his brother, he had made up his mind to disabuse the public whenever I had any opportunity and let people at home know what they have to expect here. His letters, often quite self-consciously to his family, not only seek to inform them about what life was like in Sydney, but authorise them to let others know on the basis of this sort of more reliable information, to advise other immigrants to pass on the information, which he so carefully includes. In a correspondence with George, his brother George, once about whether he should write letters for the public eye, he suggested that perhaps the letters that he wrote from time to time might eventually form a record that would be worthy of publication, and that perhaps his family could look after that, even if he didn't have time to prepare them himself. And even the thought of that possible publication caused him to launch into a long meditation on the current state of progress, obviously started beginning to envisage this later public audience. He was conscious that the colony was poised on the verge of a grand transition. Soon after his arrival, transportation of convicts had ended, and he now prophesied cheerfully that the plague spot will in course of time be removed from the faces of their descendants, and that the colony could look forward to a much more exciting sort of progress as a free society. The audience of family and that of an imagined public in all this were never far away from each other. In 1841, during 1841, John Rae made a new friend. John Skinner Prout had emigrated to Sydney from England in 1840, accompanied by his wife and 8 children under the age of 12. Prout was about 7 years older than Rae and an established artist. He had published several volumes of much admired lithographs, and in 1838 was elected a member of the New Society of Painters in Watercolours. He presumably hoped that the colony would afford scope for his work and provide a living for a struggling artist with a very large, very young family, but the times were not auspicious. Most of his money-making ventures failed, but even so, he remained energetically committed to the project of elevating colonial taste and talent in the fine arts. In June 1841, Prout became a member of the School of Arts in Sydney, and in September he delivered a series of 4 lectures open to the public on the principles of painting. His lectures were reviewed, or rather glowingly described in the Herald by that indefatigable School of Arts member and anonymous critic, John Rae. Whether they had met before June, by the end of the lecture series, Prout and Rae were firm friends. Rae wrote to his family in early October that as a result of his reviews, he had now the pleasure of Mr. Prout's acquaintance, and as he is a man of very similar mould with myself, I may call him and his wife the first home-like friends I have met with in the colony. He boasted of now being intimately acquainted with an artist here, the first, by which he meant the best, in the place. He was helping him to get up a new series of lectures, which Prout hoped to offer with a one guinea entrance fee, but the response was disappointing and the scheme fell flat. Prout's next idea was to produce an Australian landscape annual, and for this too he sought Rae's help. He would draw the pictures and Rae would write the accompanying text. At least that's the way that Rae first told it in letters home on the subject. But in subsequent months, he wrote a different account, reiterating his own long-held ambition to fill the gap of information available about the appearance of the town and harbour, and saying that he had got Mr. Prout, the artist, to join him in the undertaking. So Rae tells it both ways, and whether it was Prout's idea or his own remains a little unclear. But really, whoever said it out loud first, there was clearly some synchronicity to their ideas. Rae could play his part without having to draw the pictures and could fulfil a long-held ambition, while also, as he hoped, helping to promote his friend's reputation and helping him to turn a much-needed profit. In the meantime, Rae got to dabble in a new craft, lithography, for the pair had agreed after much conversation and calculation that the best way to produce the annual would be to get a new lithographic press established in Sydney for the purpose first of printing a work on Sydney, and in the second place then for printing plans, circulars, etc., which may be wanted. Rae waxed enthusiastic in typical fashion about his own experiments with the lithographic machine. It was a grand plan, but it was beset by difficulty, particularly the apparently insuperable difficulty in Sydney of obtaining lithographic paper of a suitable quality. The first issue was much delayed, and when it at last appeared in August 1842, its creators were disappointed by its muddy appearance. Rae's grand visions for the enterprise had been progressively smothered too under the everyday anxieties it provoked. At a time when the company he was still employed by was sinking rapidly, shares in it that he had optimistically borrowed money to purchase before leaving Aberdeen were now completely worthless. He quarrelled painfully with 2 friends from Aberdeen who'd been his housemates for most of the time since he arrived. His relationship with his colleague was coming under strain. These were dark days for the colony and for Rae, and he found it hard and indeed inappropriate to sustain an upbeat note in the letterpress for Sydney Illustrated, which continued to come out, but with increasingly long delays. The 4th and final instalment appeared early in 1844, by which time Prout had left Sydney in the hope of finding more success in Hobart. Reading Rae's letters of late 1842, which record this endless anxiety, irritation, and sadness, It's very difficult for him to imagine him going about making a suite of sketches of Sydney streets, even with the example and mentorship of Prout at his disposal. And what's more, his letters seem to suggest that Prout's example, far from inspiring Rae himself to greater efforts, caused him to abandon his own ambitions. Now, at last, he did begin to send more pictures home, as he had long promised, but they were not in the end of his own work, but of Prout's. He even forgot that he'd sent examples of his own work earlier, writing to his youngest brother, "If you allude to a picture of Sydney I sent you, but I cannot remember any such." But he promised to send some more now. "My friend, Mr. Prout, the artist, has already taken several views of this place and intends taking a good few more. And I shall in this letter enclose the first of a series I mean to send you." The following day, he wrote to another brother, "If I do not forget, I intend to enclose you another view in Sydney showing St. James Church, the courthouses, Hyde Park, etc., under the conditions mentioned in my letter to William." In other words, another image by Prout. "If you preserve all scraps of this kind sent you," he said, "it is not unlikely that in the space of a year or two you will have collected a considerable number and will be becoming better and better acquainted with this wonderful place. I have not been sketching any of late, but Mr. Prout's works are so very superior that I am glad of so good an excuse." Everything about the 1842 letters, when I first read them, seemed to suggest that far from encouraging Rae to make his own sketches of Sydney streets, his collaboration with Prout put an end, for a time at least, to his own artistic aspirations. But the clue, of course, lies in the subject matter of Prout's own sketch, which is very resonant of this one by John Rae, that was later released. So my own summary notes of this part of the letterbook end in what turned out to be premature despair. "I'd be ready to swear," I said, "he was certainly not going around making sketches of streetscapes at this time." I'd fallen victim to that air of completeness that the letterbook conveys, the temptation to read it as one might a novel, trusting that everything you need to know for a plot will be contained within its pages. History, of course, is never that simple. Thinking that I had found that that Rae was not making his sketches in 1842, I moved on, eventually reaching 1847, and the moment when Rae wrote to his friend Prout, now in Tasmania, about the camera obscura that he had been making to his own design. This makes for fascinating reading, and there's a wonderful diagram and explanation in Rae's letters about how this camera works, which is decidedly ingenious. But that camera seemed to be, in the end, a complete red herring. He said to Prout that the camera had been finished for some time, and consequently, "I have got tired of it," he wrote in January 1848. And he writes no more about the uses that he put it to, and instead seemed to move quite swiftly from the camera obscura to experimenting with photographic prints using daguerreotype or his preferred tulbotype methods. And as he wrote about those photographic efforts, his letters emphasize very much the project of making portraits of his family to send to England. The photographs seem to be very much about sort of, again, trying to build the intimacy between himself and his family. His father had died in 1849, and in that year, Rae also lost the sight of his right eye. He was despondent that he could not read, write, and draw as he was used to do. He was also increasingly certain that he would never get back home and that separation from his family was permanent. Photography seemed to promise a means of bringing their likenesses closer together, and also provided a new outlet for Rae as he turned increasingly away, it seemed, from sketching. So it seemed increasingly unlikely that the letterbook was going to yield any particular insight on Rae's watercolours. But then suddenly in 1850, there was something. In a letter to Prout rhapsodizing about the glorious art of photography that he was now discovering, Rae mentioned that he had been using for the purpose a camera that he described to Prout as an old friend, one by Daguerre, which he had recently purchased. "I'm confident," he writes to Prout, "that it is the same instrument with which you and I attempted to manufacture views several years ago." The camera had been sold to a party who went to Hobart Town. He bought it from a party who came from Hobart Town, and therefore he was pretty sure it was the same instrument. But what, of course, was singular for me was the fact that here, at last, not in 1842 when they were making those sketches of Sydney town, but years later in 1850, there's a mention at last of the fact of some of the methods that they were using to make those images. Suddenly it's absolutely clear that Rae and Prout were experimenting with the camera during the same period that they were constructing the various issues of Sydney Illustrated, and thus Rae's memory was not at all amiss when he said he had used a camera to make that sketch of York Street in 1842 or thereabouts. Having read through the entire haystack, I came across the needle at a moment when I'd almost stopped looking for it. And on top of that, a number of other things then seem to come into play that throw a lot more light on the actual nature of the collaboration between Rae and Prout and the production of these sketches. Notwithstanding Rae's modest insistence to his family that while working in Prout's shadow, he was not sketching at all and was glad of the excuse not to, there's ample evidence elsewhere to suggest that he had, in fact, during that period, made himself Prout's student. There are hints in the Gushing Review that he wrote of Prout's lectures on painting in September 1841, writing of himself in the plural and in the plural. We acknowledge that we are enthusiasts in the art of painting, that if we have not the hand to execute, we have at least the eye and heart to appreciate its beauties. But also noted that Prout's lectures sought to encourage many who had formerly neglected the art to turn their attention to it with every hope of ultimate success. Prout encouraged them to imitate nature, but also to commence with copying from good pictures till the hand was accustomed to give objects their proper treatment. And then, even when we open the inexhaustible book of nature, to make ourselves familiar with single parts before attempting complicated and difficult subjects. In the review that I mentioned earlier that Rae wrote of his own paintings, he said nothing about their quality, but did say that Rae had learnt from a master, by which he presumably meant Prout himself. The clues are also there in the similarities between these two images of George Street looking north, the close relationship between the two men, and the relationship between Prout's art and Rae's is also there in the many trusting letters that Rae wrote to Prout after the latter had left Sydney, always seeking and responding to his advice and assistance, telling him that he'd been copying his pictures, colouring his pictures, and always learning from them. It's there too in the letterpress that Rae constructed to accompany this particular image of George Street looking north, which was the last image in the published series of Sydney Illustrated. He said, "As a brick cannot be produced as a sample of the building, so a part of a street can give a stranger but little insight into the heart of a town. To afford such an insight, many views are required. And from the specimen before us, there can be little doubt that the streets of Sydney contain ample materials for illustration by the artist's pencil, and that a series of such sketches would form an interesting supplement to the present work." And so, to endeavour to wrap up sort of more rapidly, to wrap up rapidly from here, the sort of my sense of what was actually happening here is that Rae and Prout did certainly envisage later instalments of Sydney Illustrated. They intended that those would constitute a series of detailed views of Sydney streets, that in the process of producing those images, they went about with a borrowed camera and worked together to experiment in making views with the camera, that Prout probably used those in some sense to then create his own sketches for the purposes of the lithographs, but those original drawings from the camera remained in Rae's possession. They never saw the light of day as publication, but in the 1880s, Rae, with an ongoing sort of consistency of vision about the significance of these sketches, decided that it was necessary for them to see the light of day, and drew up and sort of created, I think, his own watercolours from the raw materials that he and Prout had created together so long before. In so doing, Rae sort of revealed, as I say, a consistency of vision that was a sort of very characteristic of him. This again in the letterpress in 1842, he had written about the potential interest that these images would hold in the future. Could we hope that they might survive a century? With what interest they would be viewed by the historian? In the 1880s, in a period of centennial celebration, Rae decided to draw those pictures and release them. So the project, so there is here a great consistency of purpose, if not a continuity of application. He retained this unwavering faith in the value of visual representation as a historical record for the edification and the interests of posterity. It was a triumphalist vision of colonial progress that was based, as I've hinted, and as the cover illustration of Sydney Illustrated also hints, on sort of strongly racialist views. And though we might deplore those views, I think we can still be grateful for the way Rae translated this into a commitment to capturing in camera style a still life of the town of Sydney in a single moment on its race towards the future. Though he undoubtedly massaged that image, softening lines, smoothing out uncertainties, the sketches he made and made public at the end of his life were consistent with the vision he had formed for them half a century earlier. So I'd now be happy to accept the sketches as both a contemporaneous and a camera-assisted record of early 1840s Sydney. But their value to the historian is even greater, I think, when we see them, when we can see in them all the layers that are added by a deeper understanding of the man who brought them into view. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Penny. I haven't chatted to John Rae for quite a while, so it's lovely to catch up with him and, of course, you and your research. It was lovely to see wine vaults on the side of one of the buildings in one of your first slides, although I might take it as a personal failing that I hadn't actually spotted that before now. We do have quite a few questions coming through. We'll try and answer as many as we can in the time that we have. So the first one is about religion. Now, you did mention that he prepared for publication a book from the Old Testament, Isaiah, Ezekiel. So,
yeah.
What were his religious views, and does he write about religion, or does he just reproduce that particular book?
His religious conviction was very strong. There are a number of letters. It was there's a whole, there is so much more to say about John Rae, but he writes from the outset. He writes sort of freely to his family about his religious beliefs, and that becomes much more the case after, in 1845, he married Elizabeth Thompson, who was, I think, strongly evangelical in her own faith. He was he was attached to the Church of Scotland, but after he married her, believing that it was most important that they worship at the same church, he began to worship at the Church of England himself, and was buried in the sort of the Anglican sort of section of Waverley Cemetery and so on. But his strongly held religious conviction is absolutely everywhere in the letters. So that's very consistent. Yeah.
The next question is again about his writing. Someone's quite taken by the idea of only novels can be read in colonial Sydney because it is such a warm climate. Yet apart from his poetry, and maybe the odd line in the odd letter, he is predominantly writing non-fiction, isn't he? Does he dabble with creative writing as well, or creative fiction, if you like?
I don't think so. I mean, there's an implication in there that the novels are really not worth reading, and that the true reading lies in reading non-fiction. He was, I mean, most interested in reading for information, I think, but but also, and he had a great love of poetry. His lectures on taste and his prize essay were about Spenser's Faerie Queen and Shakespearean England. I think he's got an interest, I think, more in literature and poetry sort of as a way of improving taste. And there's an implicit thing there that novels are not about improving taste, but rather about entertaining, and it's sort of being definitely an inferior sort of intellectual pursuit, one that softens the brain. He doesn't say that. I'm extrapolating slightly from 19th century critiques of the novel, but I've never caught him praising a novel or talking enthusiastically about his reading of a novel, except, of course, for Walter Scott, the honourable Scottish exception. And he does obviously have a lot of time for Scott. But yes, I don't think he wrote fiction himself.
This is a really interesting question about place and attachment. Firstly, thank you for a great talk. We have lots of comments coming through. Some people who know Rae quite well, a few people who are meeting him today for the first time. Do you think that Rae loved Sydney in the way that we are exhorted to love our city today, given his estrangement from Europe?
Look, it's really hard to say, and because I've focused, I mean, so very much, the letters are so very much in sort of, focused on the first decade or so of his residence, and it would be, I think, difficult to extrapolate from that across the whole of his life. But I think two things, or three things that I would say. One, that he talked right from the beginning about the importance of making yourself happy where you are and being content with your circumstances and not always hankering and talking about how you were going to leave as soon as you could. And he was quite critical of people who spent their colonial life talking about going home. On the other hand, he obviously did hanker, and his letters go in waves. Sometimes he writes longingly of how he hopes to return home, or very optimistically about sort of seeing his family again at some point. The homesickness is very real, and and even when you think he's very, most full of enthusiasm for Sydney, suddenly that comes through, this sense that it's not really the place he would have chosen to live all of his life. What I think he does when he's sort of selling Sydney to Sydneysiders themselves and to an imagined sort of overseas audience, is to identify the quality that Sydney has that he finds most interesting, which is the fact that it has grown so rapidly. This is the kind of the racial underpinnings of this vision, is something that I didn't really have time to elaborate on. But this is where he talks about how in the space of a lifetime, Sydney has gone from the primitive to the highly civilized and highly modern. And I think as an enthusiast for the modern and as a great celebrator of civilization, he sees this as an incredibly instructive historical narrative. And he says, in England, you can't see our primitive beginnings, but here in Sydney, you can see the whole arc of progress sort of traced out across time. And I think, in 1842, he's capturing a moment on that arc of progress. So his enthusiasm for it is sort of bound up in that imperial vision. His attachment to Sydney, I think, as an individual is much more through his personal life, through his family, as his wife and his children become the centre of his emotional attachment rather than his family at home. His centre of gravity definitely shifts. What I don't know so much about yet, but imagine also, is that his work as Commissioner of Railways, etc., is so deeply bound up with the development of Sydney that he also becomes sort of, proud of, and a sort of, has a real ownership of Sydney's growth, and that also sort of feeds into an attachment. So I think it's the colonial condition. It's everything all at once.
I sort of get a sense of fondness for where he is through some of his images, though, because there's an element of whimsy about them. He could have produced them in a much more clinical way, but there's always somebody doing something sweet, or there's a little interaction, people are holding hands, there's often something else going on that, as somebody who's just ostensibly documenting what he saw, assisted or not, he could have made that a lot more clinical than it is.
Yeah. I think just a tiny postscript, if there's time, is I think the people and the groups and the horses and so on in those sketches, I think actually seem to be product of little practice sketches that you find in here. There's a scrapbook where he's drawing all the time, and these very characteristic sort of figure sketches seem to, I think, perhaps get dropped in on top of the kind of the architectural outlines that were created by the camera, and he then peoples them with his own characters. And I think they're, not necessarily drawn from life in 1842, but definitely drawn from, John Rae's artistic imagination and talent.
Their attention to that. Although, as much as I like him, his horse legs never improve. You can almost see
his horses are bad.
Donkey equines. That is all we have time for today. Please don't forget to join us next time. Dr. Patricia Curthoys will be with us, 2023 Australian Religious History Fellow, and she'll be examining Anne Rusden, her family and friends in a study of religion, race, and gender in mid-19th century Australia. So that's Tuesday, the 3rd of September, also Australian National Flag Day, if that's your thing, at 11 a.m. And you can go online and you can book your ticket now, and of course see all the other things that are happening on site and online here at the library. Until then, thank you, Penny. Thank you all for coming. It was a terrific crowd today. Lots of friends of the library, lots of fellows, and a few special guests as well. So thank you very much. And until next time, stay safe, everyone. Bye-bye.